Muhammad is the last and final prophet of Allah. He was a mercy unto the universe. Peace and blessings be on Al-Mustafa. So he began this perfect man, sending.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Peace and the mercy of Allah be upon you. Welcome to Principles of Hadith. This is actually the last episode of this program, inshallah. And it's been a great privilege of mine to be with you. Inshallah, it's been beneficial to everyone. It's really been a journey that we started. We started from the Kur'an, learning of the importance of the messenger and his actions and his teachings to us as Muslims, and the importance of following the Sunnah from the Qur'an, and how the Sahaba wrote and memorized and learned and preserved the Hadith and carried it on to the next generation, and how after that the Hadiths were gathered together in very large collections and books in writing, and when people started forging false Hadiths and inventing Hadiths, or distorting them in some way, that Allah Almighty gave us great scholars who, with great efforts, developed the principles by which we can distinguish what is true from what is false, what is authoritative from what is spurious, so that we have, and by the blessing of Allah, through the efforts of these scholars, these sound principles of Hadith that have given us this beautiful and valuable source of knowledge that we should all be familiar with and benefit from, insha'Allah. Now I was going to talk to our panel that have been with us, and some of the other brothers who have also been with us and have contributed to this. Thank you all very much for being here and working so hard on this program. Jazakum Allahu khairan. May Allah reward all of you. We need to, inshallah, anyway, welcome and thank you for being here. And we need to maybe review some of these principles, and you can interrupt or add or comment if you want. First of all, that it is a praiseworthy thing in Islam to use tools of reason to critically examine them in a respectful way. That is, you look at the Sunnah and you respect the Sunnah, then you examine it. And you don't just reject things that you don't understand and not look at it, but you look carefully and then examine and sift as our scholars did. And that's one of the very important principles in Islam, using our minds to examine the Qur'an and Sunnah and apply it in our lives, inshallah. Another one, that the study of Hadith principles has an important goal, which is protecting the Hadith from being mixed with anything else, and interpolations or forgeries, so that it is authoritative. It is, as we say, it is hujjah. It is has authority to tell us what is right or what is wrong, what is acceptable as evidence in Islam. We talked about the Hadith being revealed or being studied in different stages. Was that very clear? I don't know if that came off clear to everybody, the different stages by which the Hadith were.
The first century, the second.
And the important thing is that the Sahaba, the environment was so conducive to the preservation of Hadith that they had already, we have, for example, their famous poetry before Islam, we know. Not in Islam, but the pre-Islamic poetry, they used to have the mu'alaqat, that they used to hang on the Kaaba.
Yes.
And we have all that preserved by memory. And many things of their stories like I remember the stories like of Antar and these stories that were preserved from before Islam.
Yes.
And even people aren't aware that in Islamic history, the scholars, for example, of tafsir, when they wanted to understand a verse of the Qur'an, maybe the wording wasn't clear, they would look to that pre-Islamic literature, because that's proof of what the Arabs understood by that word. If that word was in the pre-Islamic literature, it was a proof of what the word meant. So they often cite those examples of pre-Islamic literature in the Qur'an so that we know that in their time, that's what that word meant. And this is the proof. So nobody could have been better able to preserve something in memory as well as in writing as they did. And then the second stage was the 2nd to 3rd centuries, when they started really cataloging the hadith in works. But those cataloged, we still have many of them, aren't divided into the kind of chapters and things that make them useful for people. So what's different from the early years is that the scholars wrote hadiths and cataloged them. The companions and the tabi'in, the 2nd generation and 3rd generation, they wrote them for their own use as teachers, like the teacher's papers that he recites to the students, because maybe his memory, he might forget something, so he checks to see the wording. Or they wrote them and gave them, and their students would write from them. So they would read the hadith, and then the students would write. And maybe they would check them, and then they would qualify. When the student had written all the hadiths of that scholar, and then he would check them, and he would test them. And maybe he would add or subtract something to make sure the student knew what the hadith. Then he would sign for him a paper that gave him basically his diploma to teach that, permission to teach those hadiths to others. So they didn't just take the books and publish them so that people would read them and be confused about their meaning or their purpose. But in the golden period of Islam, the 3rd and 4th centuries, that's when most of the famous hadith collections were published. And those were circulated, thousands of copies in the lifetime of their authors. Like, who can remember their names? Bukhari, Muslim,
Tirmidhi,
Abu Dawood, Imam Ahmad is before. No, he is from before their era. He is who has the Musnad. And his collection is, of course, by the Sahabi. Abu Bakr's hadith, then Umar's hadith, Uthman's, Ali's, Aisha, Talha's.
For him, Imam Malik and his Muwatta.
Imam Malik and the Muwatta is a very useful book, but it's not just hadith.
Yes, and
it's got hadith and fiqh and opinions of Sahaba and the 2nd generation and the Imams of Medina. But in this 3rd and 4th century is called the Golden Era because the famous collections of hadith, which are very usable for people because they're organized, like Bukhari organized them, telling us, beginning with the revelation to the Prophet Muhammad, how it began, and then the chapters about fiqh, chapters about Islamic belief, chapters about practice of Islam and Islamic history, about the companions, and things that happen in Islamic history. And the 4th stage, when these hadith principles, they want to say, how did Imam Bukhari, what are his principles by which he focused on the hadith? What are the principles of Imam Muslim and Tirmidhi? What did Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal? So they started collecting, and their students writing books specially. What are the hadith principles? How do we analyze the hadith? And that took place up until the final stage of the 7th and 10th centuries. 7th to 10th centuries, when the big famous critics who analyzed the hadith, like Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, al-Iraqi, all of them, al-Mizzi, wrote and basically summarized everything and documented everything. And everything we know about the narrators of the hadith really came from them and were finished by the 10th century. And after that, it sort of declined until really the last 100 years or so, 150 years. Hadith studies weren't really emphasized. They would just memorize the hadith and say them. But they just would blindly follow a certain school of fiqh. And they would memorize the hadith, but they wouldn't apply the hadith, or they wouldn't critically examine their school, except for some scholars. There was in every generation some scholars who did, but the majority of them didn't. So they didn't really use the hadith. They just memorize them and recite them. And they would often write books or recite even hadiths which were not authentic. And so they wouldn't check those hadith, they would just recite them.
Can you review some of the key words?
Well, okay, let's talk. Okay. What are some of the words? Okay, when we look at the narrators of the hadith, we're looking at those narrators themselves. What are we looking for?
Yes.
Yes.
First of all, he is to be a Muslim of a sound mind, known for accuracy, and is to be trustworthy.
Yes, good character and accuracy in transmission. Okay, and other things they looked about these people by comparing between what they said and what other people said.
Yes.
You remember?
Another
Like Tadlis, for example.
Yes.
You guys remember what Tadlis is?
Yes. That the narrator may conceal the real character of his Sheikh.
Yeah, so he appears to be that person.
Yes.
But when we compare his hadith to other people's hadith, we see, in fact, he is hiding, he's ashamed of one of the sources of his hadith, who may be weak, so he hides his name by implying this from another teacher or changing his name.
Or
Or
giving him a nickname that, which is the nickname of another narrator who is known for accuracy.
Yes, and so sometime also then we look at the chain.
Yes.
The chain of narrators, or isnad. It starts from the person who is writing this hadith to his teacher where it came from. We look at the chain, we have different terminology. You remember some of the terminology about that chain?
The first one is marfu'a,
Yeah.
which is up to the Prophet. Peace be upon him.
So it goes all the way up to the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessing upon him. What if it just goes to the Sahabi?
Mawquf.
No.
What if it goes to the Tabi'i, the second?
Maqtu'.
Okay, alhamdulillah. Okay, what if the chain got a disconnection? There's a gap between one person and the next person. They didn't.
Munqata'.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. It is a cut or severed hadith.
Yes.
Okay. Mu'alaq is when, say for example, you read the book and it says, "An Abu Huraira qala Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam." That's a mu'alaq hadith. It doesn't even have the whole isnad in it. Just the Sahabi, just the Prophet said it. That's really the mu'alaq hadith. Like you find today in books, especially in like the chapter heading of Imam Bukhari, he often has those hadith. And so you don't bring the isnad at all. Doesn't mean there's no isnad, but you just don't bring it. We'll go for a break and we'll be back shortly. Assalamu alaikum.
Muhammad is the last and final prophet of Allah.
Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala choose whom He wills subhanahu wa ta'ala for His mercy, for His messengership, for the revelation to be revealed. This is not for the human beings to make that decision. If a person would turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sincerely, truthfully, asking for forgiveness, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promised to forgive. We have as Muslims a duty, and that is to recite the book of Allah, to ponder over the verses, the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to act according to the Qur'an. The mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala encompasses everything, but who would this mercy will be for? And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was sent to all mankind. So the ummah, or the people of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, are all mankind since the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam till the day of judgment. Why waste our life without getting to know every verse in the Qur'an, what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from us?
Muhammad is the last and final prophet of Allah.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to Hadith Principles. We're sort of summarizing the principles that we've learned so far, and inshallah, may we benefit from those and increase our iman and faith and knowledge of our religion. Now, the scholars made a great effort to catalog all the narrators in all of those books. So in the time of Tadween, when all the books were published, the major collections of hadith, they catalog all the narrators so that we can know a lot of information, and a lot of benefit comes to us to know about their reliability and accuracy and honesty or their weakness. And so there are other characteristics they look for and that they can benefit from knowing those people. And when they found, like you said, tadlis, they found that people, for example, often concealed their sources, then they would consider that hadith would not be acceptable. That would be a mudallas hadith, and so it would be considered a hadith da'if. Yes. It would be considered weak and unacceptable. So we don't use the weak hadith as a source of Islam. So when you look at the narrator, sometimes you find so many narrators that will increase the authority in that hadith. You guys remember that terminology? No. We're looking at the narrators themselves and how many there are. And so, for example, we find a hadith, it's narrated by many different companions to many of the second generation. In every link, we have many different scholars. That's called mutawatir. And what's the benefit of the mutawatir hadith?
It's a clear-cut proof.
Yeah, but why would we say that? What makes it different?
So many.
Because all those people couldn't get together and agree on deceiving us.
The manner in which it was narrated precludes the possibility of their acting in consort to perpetuate a lie against the Prophet.
So would we say, like, for example, Sahih Bukhari is considered the most authentic book.
Yes.
So are most of the hadiths in Bukhari, for example, mutawatir?
No. The bulk of the hadith are ahad.
So ahad hadiths are not on that level. That means there are only a few people, at least in some of the levels.
Yes.
So they're only ahad. And so some hadiths, it only has even just one narrator sometimes, which we call that a gharib hadith.
Yes.
But it doesn't mean that it's not authentic. As long as we're confident in the meaning as well as the person who is narrating it, then those are considered authentic. And of course, the Sahaba, the Prophet would send, for example, Mu'adh ibn Jabal to Yemen.
Yes.
And he sent different people to different parts of the world. And so that one Sahabi would go to those people and teach them. They didn't say, well, we have to have 10 Sahabi or else we won't listen to you. You're only one. So, of course, one companion is definitely enough. And trustworthy Muslim, if a Muslim scholar comes to me and he said, I've studied the hadith and I discovered this hadith is da'if, then I'm not going to say, well, bring me 10 other scholars who would agree. No. And so the hadiths in general, when they are known for their accuracy and truthfulness, then we can accept them. Sometime you will find, looking at the hadith itself, that this hadith is in contradiction to other hadith in Islam.
Yes, shaz.
Yeah, so shaz means that this hadith is violating more authentic, or this narrator is telling a version which is in violation of more trustworthy narrators or many narrators, and he's only one. Or the text itself is in contradiction to very authentic hadith. And so that is shad. And sometimes they say a hadith, and there's something in the hadith, in its isnad, an addition in its isnad or in its matan, that is mudraj. It is not the word of the Prophet. It's the word of, say, a companion or one of the narrators. So sometimes that happened accidentally. People were writing hadith or reading the hadith, and they wrote also some statement of their narrator. And somebody may have picked that up later on and read it and assumed it was all the hadith, and then they started transmitting that. But we will find that the other students who narrated that hadith, they clearly show that they narrated that from their teacher. So the benefit is that the specialists in Islamic hadith, they gather together all the versions. They look at all the chains, all of the narrators, and the different versions in the different books. They don't just look at one, like most of us, and they're content. So they really do their homework, and they research, and they gather all the material possible, and then they judge the hadith nabawi, inshallah.
Sir, I have a question, please. I have a question.
Yes, please.
What is our duty as Muslims today towards the Sunnah?
Well, of course, first of all, we are required to follow the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessing be upon him. We must, act according to the Sunnah. We must preserve it and respect it and act according to it. We must defend it when it is attacked and when people ridicule or deny it. We must speak up, and we must, in other words, inform ourselves about it. We have to learn, and that's the whole point of learning these principles, so that we can speak out when we hear distortions. And practicing the Sunnah, of course, that means following authentic teaching about Islamic beliefs and Islamic practices and practicing it in our lives. And by doing that, then we are following the Prophet, peace and blessing be upon him, inshallah.
What should we do, like, say, for example, when people are celebrating the Prophet's birthday?
Well, when people are doing something which has no authority in the Quran and Sunnah, and they think that is worship, they think that they are pleasing Allah and getting close to Allah. I say to them, who is the closest person to Allah? They'll say, the Prophet. Who are the closest people to the Prophet? The Sahaba. Who are the most informed people about the Prophet and the Sahaba? They'll say the Imams. So then you tell them, well, the Prophet didn't do that. He didn't command it. The Sahaba didn't do it. And they didn't command people to do that. And the Imams of Islam that you follow, like Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, Imam Shafi'i, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, they didn't do that or practice it and never heard of it. in their lifetime. It's something that arose later on. And so the definition of ibadah or worship is what is pleasing unto Allah, of our words or our deeds or our beliefs. Whatever we do or say or think that is pleasing to Allah is worship. And so how do we know what is pleasing unto Allah? Other than through the Qur'an and the Sunnah and the Prophet, the companions, and the Imams of Islam. Those are our sources. And so if anybody came after that generation of the Sahaba and they added a form of worship, a prayer or worship, that was not known to the Sahaba, we reject that. Okay. So if somebody invented a fast way of getting from the United States to Egypt, I'm all for that. But if they think they can invent a way of getting close to Allah that was not known by the Prophet and the companions, I reject that. Because that is knowledge of al-ghayb, the hidden knowledge that can only be known by revelation through the Prophet Muhammad, the Qur'an and the Sunnah. Can't be known by my mind. I might think, oh, this thing might be a good way of worshiping. So some people, they say, we will worship by lighting this candles. Or we'll be worshiping by singing and clapping and whistling, like the kuffar did in the time before Islam. That's what they did. Sing, clap, and whistle. Now go to the Mawlid celebration. What do you see? Singing and clapping and whistling, celebration. And they think that is the worship of Allah. And so in a respectful way, tell them that without trying to make them angry. Don't call them, oh, you're unbelievers, you're mubtadi'een, you're kuffar. Don't drive them away. But talk to them as your brothers in a respectful way. And inshallah, the Muslims, they only do those things out of love of Allah and the Prophet. And so if you guide them carefully, inshallah, they will cease from those innovations, inshallah.
Excuse me, sir. Is it obligatory upon every Muslim to be a scholar in principles of Hadith, or there is a minimum requirement?
Okay, mashallah, jazakallah. Okay, the knowledge of the Qur'an and Sunnah and its different disciplines, including the Hadith principles, is a fard al-kifaya. That means it's a community obligation. It's an obligation upon the Muslim community. So we have to have in every generation scholars, and we have to provide for their training and teaching. So we have to provide the schools and the facilities, publish the books, etc., that are needed for the scholars, and then they will teach the rest of the community. And so it's an obligation in every time and place. But all of us can't, of course, be an expert in everything. Some people devote their lives to the study of the Qur'an, or the tafsir, or the fiqh, or the hadith. We need to support them and listen to them and respect them and follow their advice, inshallah. But it's our obligation to be familiar with the Qur'an, familiar with the hadith, and its importance in Islam, that it's a source of our teaching, and to educate ourselves when we have time. We have some time for our work and some time for our careers and our education as far as our careers. And we have to have some time for Islamic knowledge, even if it's a little bit a week, a few minutes a day, to read and learn a little bit about the Qur'an and the Sunnah and the explanation of those things from authoritative scholars. We need to all be informed. Today, we will see on the internet, and everybody argues and discusses things, so we have to have information. This is the information age. The people who have access to knowledge, they can influence today. Maybe another generation, you could have influenced in your life 10 people or 20 people. You can influence millions of people.
Yes.
You can actually meet virtually millions of people. And so little knowledge, if you have it, you could do a lot of good from it. And if Allah guides anybody to the truth by you, you will have the great reward. The hadith principles are vital for all of us. It protects our religion from any changes or alteration and distortion. It is a valuable treasure which we should be grateful for, because Allah Almighty has preserved for us our faith through the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessing be upon him, and through the work of the companions and our leaders and imams thereafter. May Allah Almighty bless and guide and enlighten all of you to following the Qur'an and Hadith. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Muhammad is the last and final prophet of Allah. He was a mercy unto the universe. Peace and blessings be on Al-Mustafa. So he began this perfect man, sending his word across the land, leading only by his sunnah and the Kur'an, the word of Allah. He brought the answer to this cruel world, our beloved Prophet Muhammad.